Good afternoon and welcome to Hudson Institute. My name is Peter Rao. I'm a senior fellow here at Hudson working on American foreign policy with a particular focus on Europe. And it is my privilege today to welcome to Hudson the Honorable Jake Ellzey, the congressman from the 6th Congressional District of Texas. That's the congressional district abutting the DFW, the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, just south of Dallas. Although I think it includes Arlington, which some of you may know is the game day home of the Dallas Cowboys and the Texas Rangers. Congressman Ellzey was elected last year in a highly anticipated and very closely watched special election. Congressman Ellzey sits on the Veterans Affairs Committee and on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. He's also on the Veterans Affairs Subcommittee for Veterans Health and Disability Assistance, also on the Science, Space, and Technology Subcommittee for Research and Technology. Before he became Congressman Ellzey, he was Commander Ellzey, a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. He spent 20 years in the United States Navy, deployed 9 times, 5 times for combat missions or combat tours to Afghanistan, twice for combat tours to Iraq. He flew a variety of fixed-wing and rotary aircraft in those tours. After leaving the Navy, he served in the Texas State House and the Texas House of Representatives, and also on the Texas Commission for Veterans Affairs. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Welcome to Hudson Institute.
Thanks, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here. I've always wanted to come here, and after meeting with you in my office, I'm really thrilled that you asked me to come speak with you today.
Oh, delighted. We hope it's the first of many times. Maybe I'll just start where I left off, and that's with your biography. It's obviously a distinguished honor to be invited to the Naval Academy, but it's also a choice to attend. And so I suppose since today we're going to be talking about national security, my question would be, was national security always in your blood? Why did you want to be a soldier as a boy? Why did you end up at the Naval Academy? And this is your chance to take a shot at the other service academies if you'd like to do so.
Well, I grew up wanting to fly fighter jets, so I wouldn't say that foreign policy was it, but definitely being a fighter pilot. Initially, I wanted to fly F-15s, and then my dad said, well, you know, F-18s have to land on an aircraft carrier, and that's a lot easier than landing on a 15,000-foot runway. So I like to do things the hard way, and that was it for me. And of course, you see the Blue Angels, and of course, in 1986, when I was a junior in high school, the first Top Gun came out. So I was hooked, and of course, I went to the Naval Academy, and then once you graduate, you have your needs, and the Navy has theirs. So out of flight school, I got helicopters first. But then I got to transition and flew all kinds of jets and got to participate in a lot of things. I like to tell folks that I slipped through a lot of cracks, and also I am further proof that there are miracles, because there were some scrapes that I survived that I couldn't have got out of without the help of God, and I mean that wholeheartedly. But I had a remarkable career. I hit 830 carrier landings, so flew H-60 Seahawks, then F-14 Tomcats. We started the war in Afghanistan. Then our squadron transitioned to the brand new Super Hornet, and we kicked off the war in Iraq. And then I went back to Hornets, and we got to participate in the tsunami relief after the tsunami in Indonesia. So we got to do, you know, life-saving work, which greatly repaired a relationship with Indonesia and the United States at that time. Then I went on the ground with SEAL Team 5 as a JTAC, Joint Terminal Attack Controller, making sure they had air support in the worst time of the war, 2006 and 7, in Fallujah and Ramadi. Met my soon-to-be colleague Morgan Luttrell and Marcus on that deployment. So Morgan's going to join us from Kevin Brady's district, and then I got command of a fighter squadron, went back to Afghanistan a couple of times. So I had a remarkable career, mainly because I served with and participated in some incredible things with incredible people. And I don't say that I actually did much, but I do say I got to participate in a lot, and I'm grateful for it.
Well, before we get to those missions, I've noticed that online, at least, you've described the best job of all being air boss of the USS Ronald Reagan, which might have been your last job in the Navy, if I'm not mistaken. What is an air boss? What does an air boss do, and how does that work on an aircraft carrier?
Well, an air boss actually does do what you see in Top Gun, and that's yell at people a lot. But the air boss is responsible for 650 outstanding American sailors who are responsible for the launch and recovery of all aircraft on the aircraft carrier, the hangar bay down below the flight deck, and the air traffic pattern overhead in good daytime conditions. And it's a very dangerous environment, and some of our youngest sailors end up being the folks on the flight deck who are pushing back those arresting gear wires when they're retracted as an F-18's coming in. So you do spend a lot of time on the 5MC, which is the voice of God, over the aircraft carrier, yelling at people to get away from the foul line, which is the difference between life and death. And you often have a half a second to get that. So it's usually, when you see in Top Gun the air boss yelling because they've done the flyby, well, that was me. And you'd see somebody about to cross, and you don't have time to pick up the 5MC and say, son, you in the yellow shirt, would you please move away from the foul line? There's an incoming aircraft. It's get out of the LA, So, and it's a very busy job. There's only one air boss, and I was the only fighter pilot on the staff because the ship CO was a helo guy, the XO was a helo guy. My mini boss was an ECMO, Prowler ECMO, so I had some experiences that other folks hadn't. So, but it's a very high stress and very rewarding job, and we had zero mishaps while I was air boss, and that's the number one job.
Right, I can imagine. And then you moved to political or elected life. What inspired you to make that transition?
It's just an extension of my public service in the military. Once it gets in your blood, you have to have it. And so Governor Perry, the day I retired from the Navy, he appointed me to the Texas Veterans Commission. It's an appointed job, so it wasn't a paid responsibility, but I got to take part in policy for taking care of Texas veterans, of which there are almost 2 million in the state of Texas. And so making sure that the collaboration between the Texas Veterans Commission and the VA went smoothly, and helping out our veterans in anything that they needed was really something wonderful. And then I was a contractor in Afghanistan, flying King Airs on special missions in Bagram. After I retired, airlines stopped hiring. And then I came back from that to run for state rep, lost. And then the opportunity came, and then I got hired by Southwest. And then the opportunity to run for Congress came in 2018, and I ran again. So it's really just an extension of that public service. The opportunities show up, and here am I, send me kind of deal, where if you don't take those opportunities, I'm the kind of guy that if I don't look back at, if I was a helicopter pilot and didn't try out for jets, I know that when I was 80 years old, I would have regretted that. And the same thing with politics. If you have a voice, if you have ideas that you think can contribute to the betterment of our society, then those opportunities come up to serve, you take them. So I was always the guy who raised his hand when asked if there were any volunteers, when most people say, don't do that. But every rich experience I've had in life came from raising my hand when nobody else would.
Well, you raised your hand when it came to serving on the Texas Veterans Commission. I know you're in the Veterans Committee now.
Right.
It's a little bit off the beaten path from national security, but they do say that personnel is policy. I think most Americans have the VA either a touch point experience or a degree or two of separation, but then also the scandal that's rocked the VA periodically over the last several years. How are we doing on the veterans front writ large? I mean, what are you seeing in your committee work and generally as you're working on that issue?
Number one, a lot of that comes from the administration of the attitude of the administration towards Veterans Affairs. And I highly admire Dennis McDonough, who is the current Secretary of the VA. The President takes veterans issues very, very seriously because, as you may or may not know, he believes that his son, Bo, passed away because of burn pit inhalation and subsequently got cancer from his time in Iraq. That is his belief. And so taking care of our veterans is a priority of this administration. And so when it's a priority of the administration, you're going to see improvements out in the world. But you can never do enough. And there are always going to be instances. And the media can key on things that happen every once in a while that are truly terrible. And they do happen. But I know that with the VA committee that we have now in the House, and with Dennis McDonough at the helm of the VA, continued process improvements are always trying to be made. And we can never do enough for our veterans. And sometimes those things do occur, and when we find out what happens, we correct it. And that's our obligation, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and his widow and his orphan, is what Abraham Lincoln said. And I think that's a great motto that Dennis McDonough has adopted, and so should we as a nation. Because at the end of the day, if you go into the military in an all-volunteer force, and on the backside you feel that you're not going to be taken care of, then you're not going to incentivize somebody serving. Likewise, how the military, what its priorities are, at any given time is going to determine whether or not when mom and dad are sitting around the kitchen table and their 18-year-old son says, I want to enlist in the military,
Right.
they're going to say, do you realize what their priorities right now? I'm not comfortable with you going. So all those things are part of the package for national security. And we're continuing. Ultimately, I'd like to see a complete hand-in-hand handoff from DOD to VA for our veterans so that there's no gap in disability ratings, educational opportunities, and job opportunities. Because right now, you're out the door. And we talked about this in our roundtable last week, where you're out the door and suddenly you're on your own. Well, the military has become a family for many of these veterans, and so they don't really know how to function when the family cuts them off and closes the door. So we're always going to work on that.
Yeah, I suppose it's a little bit like a long snapper in football. The general public might not always realize what's going on at the VA until the long snapper makes a mistake, so to speak, right? And so the system functions. It's just that there are periodic spikes that the press might pick up on.
You're absolutely right.
Well, then maybe let's go back to your experiences, your combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and maybe we could just start with Iraq. I mean, what were your experiences like in Iraq? Maybe what sort of principles of warfare did you take away about America's experience there, and how the war unfolded?
I would say so let's take a look at it from now. Let's say Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. So I was never on the ground in Afghanistan except as a contractor in 13 and 14 at Bagram. Mm-hmm. So the views that I have of the withdrawal, so to speak, from Afghanistan that we had last year are based on my knowledge of the airfields in the area and what the president said could be done in 2008. If you'll recall, in 2007, when he was running for president, he said it was going to take a year for us to withdraw from Afghanistan and get everything out. 7 months if you leave all the equipment, and we don't want to do that because we're going to be fighting against them soon. So I think that when I kicked off Afghanistan to its conclusion last year, my ideas of it have changed. And my overall takeaway from both of those conflicts is, having been on the ground in Iraq, fought in the air in Iraq, on the ground in Afghanistan and in the air in Afghanistan, is we owe it to our country to involve Congress better. We owe it to our country to have a strategy and an end game discussion on what it is we're trying to do. And I think as we look at Ukraine and what we're trying to do everywhere else, the president needs to get with Congress and discuss these things. We need to have a strategy and we need to have an end game. What are our goals? Because when you ask the American people to send substantial amounts of aid in all forms and have to deplete some of our armaments here, what's our goal? Why are we doing this? Because it's not an inexpensive tab. I'd like to know what it is we're trying to accomplish there, because I have my ideas of what we should be doing and what I would like to do. But we need to hear that from the president. And I think that right now people are a little concerned about both of those conflicts, Iraq, how it ended, certainly Afghanistan, how it ended, and now where are we going here? People are a little tentative, at least in my district. They're going, why are we doing this? They want an answer from me because I voted yes, why we're doing this. So I think, to answer your question, with benefit of hindsight, having participated in both, a 20-year war is a long one. Mm-hmm. And you'd better have a mission end goal in mind that you tell the Congress and you tell the American people, and that's what you go accomplish. Which is why Desert Storm was so successful. Did we go far enough? Arguably not, but H.W. Bush put together a fantastic coalition that was not going to be overridden, and we got in, we accomplished our mission, and we got out. That's what we told the UN, that's what we told the American people, and we got it done. We need to return those kinds of days, and including Congress more.
Yeah, it's a simple concept, but really setting a policy goal and then implementing and articulating a strategy to get there is kind of the essence of statecraft. And I know you've introduced at least a couple of pieces of legislation just demanding that from the administration, that it kind of lays out publicly the policy. Maybe to go back to Afghanistan then, since you just discussed it, one of the administration's theories, and the president said this in a major address announcing the end of the war in Afghanistan, was that we would be able to keep an over-the-horizon capability, an offshore strike capability. Now, I just looked the other day at one of the latest Inspector General reports from, I think it was late May, which would have covered the period up to the end of March. And it noted that there has not been a single counterterrorism strike since the Afghan withdrawal up through that period. Now, perhaps terrorism has gone away in Afghanistan. I rather doubt it. But I suppose what I'm saying, and might be leading the witness, and you might have a different view on this, but can you really execute an over-the-horizon strategy without boots on the ground?
No.
All right, next question.
We built Bagram. I flew out of Bagram. It had remarkable capability. It's in the northeast corner of the country where you have access and very short flight times to a lot of different places that we're interested in. And we gave it away. There is no excuse for how we got out using only the airport that we did with a single runway. Single runway means you can only land or take off one airplane at a time. At a dual parallel runway airport like Bagram with heavy lift capability, C-5s going in, I think the AN-225 before it got destroyed in Ukraine could fly out of there. You could fly anything in and out and you can do them simultaneously. We gave that away and we gave the Chinese an entry. I don't understand how that happened. Furthermore, nobody got fired. We publicize firing our 05s, our 06, our unit level commanders. You see it in the Navy Times, Air Force Times, Army Times all the time. That abysmal withdrawal, nobody lost their job. Nobody? Nobody?
Right.
I know that if I have a mishap as a commanding officer, if a ship driver runs aground or hits another ship, they're gone immediately. We had 13 Americans dead that shouldn't have gotten killed. We had over 100 Afghanis. The number is most definitely higher than that.
Right.
Blinken didn't lose his job. Milley didn't lose his job. Nope, nobody. So we're signaling that, from big picture, well, that's just part of the deal. But down at the lower level, we're going to fire you if you're showing any level of incompetence, and we're going to publicize it. That's a problem. So we should have never given up Bagram, and we should have never gotten out on the timeline that we did. I don't know who was actually driving the timeline because Biden in 2008 said exactly how long it was going to take. So did he shift? Did he change his mind? Did somebody convince him? Those are the answers that need to be asked, and I think when we take back the House, those questions will be asked. But if you're failing upward, meaning you can fail and you can continue to keep your job, we have a serious problem.
Yeah, I'm sure your staff will be quaking in the boots listening to that answer about consequences in Congressman Ellzey's office if things go wrong, but it's good to hear that accountability still matters. So we've been talking for about 20 minutes, and we've delayed as long as possible, but it's impossible not to get to the war in Ukraine because that is really, in a lot of respects, the issue du jour that I think for a long time was even driving all of American news. I mean, now one could argue that some other topics like inflation and some domestic issues are right up there, and perhaps even having surpassed Ukraine. But what's your assessment of the war? How do you think the American performance has gone? I would argue the Ukrainians have been tenacious in defense and have given their all. But as we record this conversation today, they do seem to be a little bit back-footed by relentless Russian artillery bombardments and rockets that are raining down on their positions. And I'm not sure they're equipped to respond to all of that. But how do you think the war is going? What's your assessment of the American posture in this conflict?
It's been going for 112 days, right? So it was supposed to last for 3, according to our best and brightest, and they were wrong. So I would say that for what they've had to contend with, the Ukrainians have performed remarkably, honorably, heroically, in a way that very much like World War II, England did and other nations did when put upon by a nation that unprovoked went and attacked them. And I think it's not just the war in Ukraine. This is so much bigger. And I've had constituents ask me at home, why do we care? Why is Ukraine important? There's no strategic interest in Ukraine, and I got that as a definitive statement from one of my constituents. And I think I convinced them otherwise in that, but it is. 1/3 of the world's wheat comes from Ukraine. And as we were talking before the hit, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I can sleep outside pretty easily, but I can't go without food. When you have, the Arab Spring started because of food shortages. We haven't seen the effects of that yet, but once the fall comes And as we, as you guys did such a great job on talking about the blockade of the Black Sea, 50 million people are at risk of starvation. Governments fall. When governments fall, wars spread. This is the war of our time right now, and how we respond as Western nations, as democracies, to evil. And I do believe in good and evil, and I think this is evil manifested. So I would say that they're fighting extremely well. I don't publicly talk about it very much about how we got here, because it's almost irrelevant. Anybody can armchair quarterback and judge. If they didn't say anything before, and then they start saying, well, here's what happened before, you really don't have a right to talk. But I think that any administration can signal its strengths or weaknesses leading up to a conflict like this, and I think that's exactly what happened. We should have, coulda, shoulda, woulda. But the Ukrainians need a lot of the weapons that they didn't get until after the fact. I know that the MLRS weapons are getting to them slowly. They need them in the east, but you have logistical issues between Poland and Ukraine, and you're very well versed in this. The tracks are different. Everything's different. So this is extremely important that the Ukrainians pull this out and continue to damage Russia's standing. Number one, Russia, I don't think anybody's going to be wanting to buy any of their aircraft or their tanks anytime soon. That's going to hurt them. They've lost 22,000 troops. It's going to be very hard unless they draft them to get their military back. And Putin has shown that he's not a reliable man. Now, the fact that Ukraine has done so well against Russia, I think, should signal to other nations, number one, your tactics and how you train, West versus East. There's a severe difference, because in spite of all of its numbers, there's, in an authoritarian military, authoritarian countries, they don't want independent thought at the sergeant level. Mm-hmm. Well, since I know it continues to be discussed as the annexation, the invasion of Ukraine via Crimea 8 years ago, we have been helping the Ukrainians train their military. And what we depend on in the United States is independent thought at the non-commissioned officer level, meaning you can make decisions tactically on the turn of a dime, and you don't need to go and ask a general. So they lost a lot of generals in Russia because they massed up 40 miles of tanks, and the private at the front of the line didn't know which direction to turn, so a general comes down and they get him. So China should be learning from this, and since they model their military very much like that of Russia, they should understand that they probably don't have the command and control. If they take out, if anything goes wrong at the beginning of that war, if they decide to go after Taiwan, who's going to make those decisions? Do they have a sergeant that can make that decision or not? And if not, you're looking at some difficulty.
Does that suggest you think that the war in Ukraine is delaying Chinese calculations or giving them pause, or is that a jump too far in the conclusion?
I don't know. I think that China is going to judge what our nation looks like. I mean, if we have a looming recession and they misjudge where our national resolve is, that could turn up the timeline. I am not. We did a tabletop at the U.S. Institute of Peace the other day, and I deferred back to some. It was a fascinating exercise on the possibility of war with China and Taiwan, and then who else gets enveloped in that on what their timeline would be. I think it's widely accepted that timeline was 25, but in the United States, it very much looks like we would have a Republican president and a Republican Congress that would probably show more strength and resolve than what we see right now. And so if they need to, they may turn it up and advance that. I don't know. That's why I really have enjoyed my participation in the Aspen Institute, the Hudson Institute, because I'm a fighter pilot, so on a tactical level I know a lot, but on a large strategic level and with the mindset of the Communist Chinese Party, I couldn't begin to predict that. My hope is that it would push them back, but who knows? I mean, with a looming recession and us showing some weaknesses here and there on decision making and resolve, I mean, Antony Blinken was responsible for the United States response under the Obama administration to the annexation of Crimea.
Right.
And he's still in charge. And we failed in Afghanistan, and he's still in charge. So I don't think he's done a very good job, and keeping him on board would signal that that the administration is just fine with that.
Right. Well, it was a great answer. Unfortunately, we have to cut the whole thing because anytime you mention a rival think tank like the Aspen Institute or USIP, we cut it from. I'm just joking from the recording. No, I'm glad you mentioned repeatedly the 2014 move because I made the mistake speaking to Ukrainians recently to mention the number of days since the start of the war, as I put it, and they immediately interrupted and said this goes back to us for 8 years, and we've had active combat operations in the Donbass all along, and of course Crimea was taken from us that year. So. It's a long-standing conflict, and sometimes I think we in the West think of war as sort of discrete end and start dates, 39 to 45, or 50 to 53, or 1914 to 1918. But, the Russians have shown that they're prepared, I think, to indefinitely, at various kind of degrees, turning up and down the temperature, try to undermine their targets until, they're ready to take them. And I also, quite frankly, think that unlike us in the West, which also think of war sometimes as big set-piece battles like Stalingrad or Waterloo or Gettysburg, they think of it more as a long-term battle of attrition and wills. And so we were very riveted by the long armor column outside Kiev, focused on the battle for Kiev. And once the Russians withdrew and redeployed towards the Donbass, I think American attention flagged a little bit because, well, the battle for Kiev was won. But, in the end, that was an opening salvo on a much larger conflict. And Putin has shown, going after Grozny in the Chechen wars, that he can take another bite of the apple down the road. I also think it's a great point on the nature of authoritarian systems. I mean, we as democracies sort of show our warts and all to the world, and we're sort of an open book to conflate metaphors. But these authoritarian systems, they have this shiny veneer, but Putin thought, based on what his intelligence services was telling him, that he had permeated the political class, that these were feckless people that were going to collapse. And he was being told by his military that all these capabilities were there, they would be able to thunder run to Kiev. And it turns out that perhaps a general or two had built a nice summer dacha elsewhere in Russia rather than investing in the military. And I think that's pitfalls of authoritarianism, that it's a good thing to remind our publics why we're democracies and not authoritarian powers. Maybe to bring up an earlier answer in the context of Ukraine about defining our end goals and then the strategy to get there. Have you heard from the administration what their theory of victory is and how we plan on getting there, or anything close to that? The most I've heard is that they do want to damage the Russians and set them back, but I've yet to hear the administration publicly articulate a desire for the Ukrainians to win, perhaps because that would mean empowering them to a point where they fear some sort of escalation with the Russians. And having been in Berlin 2 weeks ago, I have to say a lot of my German interlocutors there were being briefed on background, a similar thing from the administration, that, well, we're not really all that far away from the Germans because victory is perhaps a bit much. Is that an unfair characterization, or is that kind of where you see the Biden administration too?
No, that's absolutely correct. And when Afghanistan was going down, why are we doing this? No articulation of that. What is our strategy here? What is the rush? Why are you going to leave this equipment here? What are we doing? You want $40 billion. Why? It's not that it's wrong. I voted yes, but it was an extremely expensive bill, and
Right.
A lot of people back at home were upset about that. I understand the strategic implications of it, but we need to lead. Now, this is a lot like 1938. In 1938, we had, and I characterize it publicly this way: little men with inferiority complexes surrounded by yes men start world wars. Mussolini, Hitler, Emperor Hirohito. 1938. Now we have Xi Jinping, who has outlawed Winnie the Pooh. We have Vladimir Putin, who clearly has something psychologically that bare chest and diving for antiquities. Right. The Ayatollahs and Kim. This is very similar now, except now this is pre UN, because for the first time ever, a permanent member of the Security Council has started an unprovoked war, which has eliminated any chance for the Security Council to leverage any power. Now we're looking at China, another permanent member of the Security Council, who is thinking about doing the same thing. Where's the UN in all this? Every time somebody talked about the UN, they are now toothless. Right. So this requires leadership from the world's largest superpower, which is the United States, leading the rest of us, leading the other countries, leading Germany, leading Italy, leading France. And right now, we're not on all the same page. Poland and Lithuania and those nations that have felt the brunt of Russian aggression and Soviet aggression in the past know all too well what all of this means. And then you have other nations that aren't joining in, and it's not a NATO conflict either yet. So this is where we need real leadership, and I don't think we've seen that. And I think that if there were a Republican president right now who was in Rehoboth Beach enjoying the beach at a time of everything else that's going on in the world, he would be torn to shreds. And so I think that the media is ignoring the lack that we're not leading in a way that we should, because these are tenuous times. So when we talk about going back to Ukraine, 36% of the world's wheat comes.
Yeah.
The world needs its wheat. It is strategic for the rest of the world. Not us, we produce our own. It is for the rest of the world. India has said, second largest exporter of wheat, says they're not exporting anything this year. The world's largest exporter of sunflower oil, which fries all your snack foods. 40% of the world's nitrogen, which comes from Belarus and Russia, which provides for healthy and vibrant crops. This is a strategic issue, and watch what happens in the fall if we're not anticipating that.
Yeah, you take our snack foods away from us. You better watch out.
For some, but I mean the cheap bread, free bread in the middle. But you're right. So it's all strategic, but we can't see it when we're paying $5 a gallon of gas. And so, you know, there are so many things at play right now that it's a slow grind. If there is a plan, I think that, and I'm not on foreign affairs or armed services, so maybe he has, but I don't get the sense that there has been any delineation of strategy or to the American people. I haven't heard it. Have you?
No.
And I think that people are drawn to somebody who says, here's where we're going. Some people may not like it, but at least there's a direction. And the world needs that leadership right now from the United States. And I will tell people all the time that when you pray for this president, because these are difficult times, and he is the president. We need him to succeed. We need this administration to succeed, because if they don't, we don't either. I've got a 13-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old son. I don't want them to be in 8 years, my son in 8 years, going to have to fight on behalf of something that we didn't do now. So we need that leadership.
Well, one area where you've been very active in pressing, demanding, cajoling, all the nudging for leadership is something you just referenced at the pump, gas prices, at the energy front. And I've noticed you've initiated some legislation on this. You've co-sponsored legislation. I'd sort of describe, if I may, and please interrupt if this is mischaracterizing you, but there's sort of three planks to the Jake Ellzey energy point of view. One is we need all of the above energy. We need to be energy dominant, as you put it. The second is to cut off Russian energy. The third is to help supply our allies and friends to the extent we can. Do you think you're making progress on the Hill with that message? Are your colleagues, I know energy is now spiking. It's not just a narrow, say, for some progressive climate change issue or for some Republicans. I mean, it seems to be really a major league issue on the Hill. Do you feel that? Do you feel like you're making progress or not really?
I don't think any Republican would say that they feel like they're making progress. August Pfluger has been, he's got a great motto, Midland over Moscow. Remember, it was only a year and a half ago, just over, where Rick Perry and Donald Trump had produced all those things we're talking about. And the Congress wasn't involved in sweeping them all away. It was just the administration. Mm-hmm. So, and the American people can remember what it was like a year and a half ago. And we were a net exporter of energy, and we did have LNG ships going all over the world. And we did have pipelines providing cheap fuel throughout the United States and elsewhere. So it's recent in our memories. We know it's the administration's goal. And I remember when February 24th, I think the first thing out of John Kerry's mouth was, right, well, I just hope that we can continue to worry about the environment and make sure that this war doesn't affect the environment. Let me tell you, I remember 1991 when Saddam Hussein lit off all those oil wells in Kuwait. The biggest cause for environmental and ecological disaster is massive warfare, and that's what's looking us in the face. So this administration is unable to do what we call in the military, when you're on a 7-hour mission over Afghanistan and your tanker went down and you're over the middle of the country, you have to adapt. It's called overcome by events, OBE. This administration has no capacity to do that, and they are single-sided, laser-focused, which is a term I don't like to use, but they seem to be purely about environmental and going green to the expense of everything else. I don't understand that. And whoever's calling those shots has got complete control of this administration and its policies, and it's affecting the entire world. I can't understand what the goal is, but it's overridden everything else, and it's not a realistic view. So they can't get to where they want to be just by hoping that it happens. And I think that's why I have characterized this administration one that is comprised almost completely of those for whom life is an academic exercise. And there are second and third order effects to everything you do in life. You know, and as we talk about world security, this is a tenuous time. Israel's government has just folded up, and they're going to have a special election in 3 months. Colombia has gone from being a strategic partner in the war on drugs to now being taken over by leftists, and we'll see how far left they go. We have a border that has millions of people coming across it as illegal immigrants, but not, more importantly, but perhaps from a national security standpoint, the number one killer of 18 to 45-year-olds, military age people in the United States, 287 people every day dying from fentanyl that's brought here, the raw materials from China, put together by the cartels in Mexico. I think the Mexican cartels represent a clear and present danger, and I understand what that means to the security of the United States. And the world is watching as we have these things approaching us from all over the world. This is a tenuous time.
Yeah, and the fentanyl crisis is near and dear to Hudson's heart. Our president and CEO, John Walters, was the drug czar in the George W. Bush administration, and he's written widely on this, and cutting off supply really is a national security issue. I mean, the number one responsibility of the state, arguably, is to know who enters and exits your country, and if you don't have control over that, it's hard to have control over much else. Related to the fentanyl crisis, of course, is the People's Republic of China, and I thought maybe we'd switch gears very, very quickly there. I know you were on a CODEL to Southeast Asia, I think it was last November, which is now a little dated, but nonetheless, you've also introduced legislation on the PRC. Can you give us our impressions from Southeast Asia, which is really, I think, in part where the competition is playing out between the U.S. and China, and on America's China policy writ large?
Well, I think that the possibility for a great rejuvenation of diplomacy and alliances exists in Southeast Asia. Nations who might not have been our allies or even our friends before. We have a great opportunity for that with the Quad. Nothing happens without Japan, and so I think you're seeing them make moves to strengthen themselves in spite of their previous willingness to stay away from military intervention and building their military. Australia, of course, is a great ally in that, and they've felt the pressure more than anybody in the past. We need to make sure that India is our best friend forever. We have some cultural and structural issues with both Turkey and India, but we need to overlook those at times like these. If you'll recall how we won World War II, we had an ally that turned out not to be so great, but we had to do what we had to do at the time. And I'm not comparing either of those two nations to far away from what the Soviet Union was. But we need to overlook our problems with India and Turkey and get past it and combine and say, anybody that comes after us, you're going to feel a mighty fall. And it's not just coming from the United States. We're all joined in this, and we have to put a stop to these kinds of adventures on the part of nations that should not be participating in this. We got the Communist Chinese wrong. The era of strategic ambiguity should have ended when Xi Jinping became president for life. What we started off with 20 years ago, 10 years, even 5 years ago is not what we have now. And we need to recognize Taiwan, and we need to stop with the strategic ambiguity and say, nope, because somebody mentioned it very well at the tabletop the other day. He turned to me and he said, nobody's mentioned this, but if Taiwan fails, it will be catastrophic for the modern world. Modern life as we know it will change drastically because we've become so dependent on the technology that we use on our phones and everywhere else. And Taiwan's 2 levels ahead, 2 generations ahead of any technology that we might be building in Arizona for chips. It is a strategic must keep. And so the world needs to look at it that way. And we need to inform our public that that's how important Taiwan is, because if you really don't pay attention to it, and I don't expect most people to, then you're going to just say, well, why would we risk a war with China and Taiwan? We need to show strength well in advance of that. You can't respond constantly, and that's what we have responded. That's what we've been doing lately. And I would add that once we publicized that Joe Biden was the only one in the administration against going after Osama bin Laden, once that became public, then the adversaries had a piece of intel that tells something about Joe Biden. And if he ever became president, who's the one guy in the room who's going to say no? We should have never publicized that. And I think as we do in the military right now, we need to stop broadcasting everything we're doing, because we should be on a strategically a messaging wartime footing where we're not going to tell you anything that we're doing. We're not going to publicize all these aircraft we have. We're not going to publicize the crash of that aircraft the way that we do. Mm-hmm. We're not going to talk about the O-5s who get fired for having a collision at sea. We're not going to talk about that anymore. And you're not going to know what capabilities we have, because we're far too open about it right now. They're not. And we're the only nation that does that, and we need to stop.
Yeah, that also applies to policy areas. I mean, before the war in Ukraine, to return to that, President Biden on the South Lawn of the White House in front of rolling cameras announced that the U.S. was not going to be putting ground troops into Ukraine, which one could debate if that's a sensible policy or not. But to let Vladimir Putin into your calculations, it's not like
Sure.
He's returning the favor.
Donald Trump was never predictable,
right,
on anything,
right,
and it drove people crazy, because are you gonna poke that bear because you don't know if he's going to eat you or just swat you? And I think that's important for an administration, is to show strength and just don't try that. Why not? Try it and you'll find out.
Right. I think the other implication from your remarks, oftentimes Washington's sort of divided between regional specialists. So when we look at like the war in Ukraine, we think of the implications, for example, for Nordic security, Finland and Sweden coming inside of NATO. But the whole world is watching these crises. And like with the bin Laden example, the same could apply to how the Taiwanese are reading the war in Ukraine. I mean, to what extent is the United States prepared to defend partners and allies that are not in rock-ribbed, Article 5 type of arrangements with us? And that very quickly, I think, can set loose a chain of events that are problematic for us. I also think it gets to the point that, there are different layers to these foreign policy constellations. There's the geographic element, like Taiwan is clearly part of the first island chain. Ukraine is a crucial breadbasket right on the Black Sea. Then there's the economic front. When Taiwan, you mentioned the semiconductor industry, and Ukraine has its wheat commodities you talked about. And then the third would be, I think, some of the precedents that's being set. For example, with the Ukrainians, they gave up, and I know we've talked about this offline, their nuclear weapons in 1994 for some admittedly somewhat loose guarantees, but nonetheless guarantees that they'd be part of a free American-led order in Europe. And if you're a third country watching, you think to yourself, well, they gave up their nuclear weapons, now they're being smashed to bits. Meanwhile, the Iranians are hurtling towards the nuclear threshold, and the consequences don't seem to be all that steep. So the conclusion is, well, if the consequences for going for it aren't that bad, but for surrendering it or not having it are, destruction of your country, maybe nuclear weapons make sense for us. And I think that is a worry that American presidents have worried about this since President Kennedy, but I do think it's reached a new level of emergency that I'm really concerned about. And with that, maybe I'll take you to the Middle East, because we're covering the world. Wasn't my plan, but here we are.
Let's go. Let's go there.
That's right.
We're all linked now, and that's the American people want to think we can do all of this. Why don't we just? When I hear "why don't you just," my answer is that's a great idea, but that's going to take 10 to 20 years. That's not the world we live in. Yeah. And so I'm sorry. Continue.
No, great. So that's another area where I've noticed you've been active on the foreign policy legislative front is Israel, and you're a very strong supporter of Israel. The Israeli government, as you mentioned, just collapsed. They announced new elections. We'll see how those turn out. But the real governing issue in the region, you have legislation on the Abraham Accords and trying to deepen and expand that, is the threat of Iran. What's your read on the Iran issue as it stands?
If Iran gets a nuclear weapon, so will Saudi Arabia, and we don't want that. And the Iranians have been the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. There is no such, and we need to be treating them as such, not doing deals with them. The Obama administration did a deal. There is no such thing in the Constitution of the United States that talks about a deal. That wasn't ratified by the Senate. I don't know how it got through. I don't know how we gave them billions of dollars. There should be no deal this time. You can't predict what Israel will do because you never want to go after somebody when you perceive that they're weak, because that's not going to go very well for you. And the fact that their government has collapsed isn't really something that defines what the response is going to be to an attack from rockets. They will still respond, but it could continue to give Iran the idea that what they're doing is okay. Furthermore, what Russia is doing and being able to threaten us with nuclear weapons, even on a tactical scale, is also encouraging other people other nations that maybe they should too. None of this is good. But in the Middle East, Iran cannot be allowed to get a nuclear weapon. We should not be making any more deals with them. We should make life very, very difficult for them and continue to support Israel all day long. Every day, as strong as we possibly can. So I see no deal forthcoming, and of course, this administration recognizes that it's kind of under the gun. Once a Congress changes hands, then you have the power of the purse. So an administration may want to do some things. They don't get the money from Congress, they can't have it. So they recognize they've got about 7 months left to do whatever damage they deem they want to do, which on their side probably seems like it's a good idea, but they're on the clock, and so I don't see a deal happening in Iran. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, but nor should there be.
Well, I hope you're right, and since we've now covered, I think, 4 or 5 continents, we'll have to have you back to talk Latin America and Africa next time. And the Arctic and the North, the high North. But thanks so much for coming by, Hudson. It's really a privilege and a pleasure to have you here, and we look forward to hopefully involving you in more of our work going forward. And we look forward to seeing all of you again on our next webinar. Thanks so much.